Hello, and welcome to this special Blackwell online podcast in association with the Edward de Bono Foundation. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Dr. Edward de Bono, world authority in the field of creative thinking. Dr. de Bono was born in Malta and trained first in medicine and then in psychology. His impact on the way we think began over 40 years ago with the publication of The Use of Lateral Thinking, which has since been followed by literally dozens of books which have sold millions of copies in scores of world languages. Dr. de Bono has been described as the father of lateral thinking, progenitor of creative thinking, and as a tool maker by Peter Gabriel. When I met him recently, I asked him how he himself described what it was he did.
Your question opens up a whole area that we do not have a box, a category called thinking. So in bookshops, people say, where do we put your books? Do we put them on the philosophy? Do we put them on education? Do we put them on the humor? No. Universities don't have a faculty called thinking. There isn't such a definition or a box. I am a thinker, and thinking is by far the most important human skill, but we don't have a label for thinking. We just don't. We have a label for philosophy, which is not at all the same thing, but we actually do not have a label for thinker. So I call myself a thinker.
And sometimes the adjective which attaches itself to thinking is lateral thinking, and sometimes it's constructive thinking, sometimes it's creative thinking. And I wondered if you could just maybe tease those apart a little bit for me.
Well, the reason we have to have an adjective is precisely what I said, that thinker by itself is not acceptable. Now, lateral thinking is based on an understanding of how the brain works as a self-organizing information system which allows incoming information to organize itself into patterns. All patterning systems are asymmetric. So lateral thinking means moving laterally across from one pattern to another, and when you get there, in hindsight, it's obvious. So it is directly related to that lateral movement. In practice, it means changing the approach, changing the concept, changing the perception, rather than working harder with the same concept or perception or approach. It's lateral thinking. Creative thinking means producing something which is new and has value. And I emphasize has value because too many creative people think that being different for the sake of being different is creative, which it is not. It has to have value. Constructive is creative in the sense that you're making something happen. You're doing something which wasn't there before, but it may not be original in itself. It's original in the sense if there was wasn't a pile of bricks there, there is now. But the concept may not be new. So constructive means making something happen. And to do with that, there's a word I invented, operacy, skills of doing. Education is all about numeracy and literacy, but not enough about operacy, making things happen, doing things, operating.
I wondered if I could take you back over 40 years to the dawn of lateral thinking, if you like, and ask you, what was it that made you first think that the human mind had untapped potential that could be unlocked in the way you described in that first book?
Well, you see, my background is medicine, and I'm doing medical research. We're dealing with complicated systems, glands, kidneys, circulation, respiration, how they interacted, and that really developed the idea of self-organizing systems and how they worked. And that was the foundation. Indeed, when I wrote my book, The Mechanism of Mind, in 1969, that book was read by the leading physicists in the world, Professor Mario Gell-Mann, who got his Nobel Prize for discovering the quark. He was very enthusiastic. He commissioned a team of computer experts to simulate it. He said, yes, it works exactly as you predict. And he's always been a great supporter. So that background and saying, well, the brain's very good at making patterns, not very good at switching patterns. And so from that arose the idea of lateral thinking.
It seemed to me, looking back at that book and then looking at your other later books, yes, that visualization was an important technique. I think you described semantic antics as kind of playing with words, and in contrast to that, there is visualization as a way of seeing things differently, literally seeing things and metaphorically seeing them differently.
Well, it's visualization, but it's also understanding the system base. Now, as philosophers playing around with words, they could never see why, for instance, every valuable creative idea is always logical in hindsight. Now, a philosopher would say if it's logical in hindsight, it's logical in foresight. Not true at all. In an asymmetric system, something may be obvious in hindsight, invisible in foresight. But that's only if you can visualize the system. If you're playing with words, you just can't see that.
In addition to visualization, there's a powerful force of metaphor in the way that you encourage people to understand their thinking, it seemed to me. I was thinking of the thinking hat.
Yes. Well, metaphors are very important for carrying processes and change and so on. Otherwise, it's just complex descriptions, you just can't remember them. So the metaphor thinking hat is related to our concept, put on your thinking hat, and the different hats, different thinking.
Your most recent book, 6 Frames, is, I suppose, in a way, a response to the plethora of information that we are swamped with all around us, but particularly via the computer screen. Tell me what the sort of impetus for the 6 Frames was in that regard.
It is exactly as you said, that we live in an information age, we're surrounded by information. How do we treat it? How do we react to it? How do we stop being overwhelmed by it? How can we get the most value from it? And how can we test its relevance, its value, its validity? So, as you rightly say, the vastly increased input of information makes it necessary to develop better ways of dealing with information.
Give me an example, perhaps a concrete example of how one could use one of these frames in order to cope with the sea of information.
Well, one of the very simple one is the point of view. What is the point of view of the person writing it? Are they trying just to describe their own personal point of view? Are they trying to reflect different points of view on the subject? And if so, how honestly? And so when you look at something, you say, well, what is the point of view that is intended? What is the point of view expressed? Then another frame might be, what is the validity? What is the background to this? And so on. So there are just 6 different frames to cover it.
And I suppose then your entire oeuvre gives people a toolkit from which they can choose things as suits the situation.
Well, you see, one of the key things about perception is attention. What are you paying attention to? If we're looking at space, you can tell someone, look north or look south or look east, and you direct your attention in that way. So we need some, as it were, directions to direct our attention. So these tools become frames to direct our attention. Right now, I'm looking at the validity of this. Right now, I'm looking at the relevance. Right now, I'm looking at the value. Right now, I'm looking at the point of view. And since you can't do all these at once, you separate them out. It's rather like if you're in a room with a lot of colors and someone says, look at the colors. There are a lot of colors. If someone says, okay, I just want you to pick or focus on the things which are yellow, fine. Now focus on things that are red. Then you see the colors more clearly.
So I suppose those are analytical or assimilative tools. But I wanted to go back to the sort of ideas generation, the creative side of thinking, because it seemed to me that perhaps a very good example of where we need to make shifts or lateral shifts and think beyond the vertical was in climate change, where the whole of humanity's future really requires solutions which are not stepped increments, but actually much more radical. I mean, do you see that as an area where your approach to thinking could really make a big difference?
Yes, well, I'll give you 2 examples. One is a real story. I was talking to the environmental group in California, and they said we have a problem with factories on the river, they put out pollution, people downstream suffer. So as a provocation, I said, pull the factories downstream of itself, which sounds pretty illogical. How could it be downstream of itself? From it comes a very simple idea, that we legislate that if you build a factory on the river, your input, where you take in water, must always be downstream of where you put out water. And I'm told that has now become legislation in about 13 countries. Very obvious, very logical. So if you put out pollution, you're the first to suffer. Very obvious. So that's an example of how you put in a provocation. Again, supposing you said we want to discourage people from buying cars which guzzle gasoline, put out a lot of carbon dioxide, what I would do is I wouldn't just put a tax on such cars, because that is not so powerful. I would say, okay, we would put a high tax on you, but we will use that to subsidize the guys who buy smaller or electric cars. So when you drive into a gas station and you see the little car next to you, and you say, my God, I'm paying for that guy's car. That is much more effective than just saying I'm paying tax.